Good afternoon and welcome to the third session of the Orkney Climate COP. This one, each session is a key one, and this one is particularly significant because when you look back over the centuries in Orkney, there's been hard times when there weren't enough jobs for young people, hard times when there wasn't enough food for anyone, young or old. But it's difficult to think of a time when it's been so difficult for young people to get houses. And in a community, that cannot find houses for its young people, that community has really no long-term future. However, there are people with ideas, and our two speakers certainly have ideas for that. They're going to round off with recommendations for action, and those recommendations will be assessed by a panel. And I'd like to ask, as a first step, our four panel members to introduce themselves, starting on the left.
Hello, I'm Alexander Annell, and I'm a beef farmer from South Ronaldsay. Keen interest in technology and science and all of that.
I'm Aisling Phillips. I'm from Hoy, and I've been working in and around community development and climate in Orkney for the last 3 years.
Hello, I'm Finn McLeod. I run a small software company based mostly here in Orkney.
Hi everyone, I'm Adele Lidderdale. I've worked in the renewables industry here for 10 years and I'm also interested in policy.
Thank you very much indeed, panel. And the format is our two speakers will set out ideas, assess, analyse the situation, set out ideas, and then we'll go back to the panel for one question each to help them with their assessment, and then it's open to discussion from questions and answers from yourselves. But now I'll introduce the two speakers. Luke Fraser is the Community Development Manager for the North Ronaldsay Trust, and Luke has many years' experience in the housing sector. Stephen Kemp's company, Orkney Builders, are known for many developments across Orkney, and Stephen himself is a former president of the Scottish Builders Federation. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you both have to say.
Good afternoon. Right, we're going to do things a little bit differently. We're going to have a bit more of a kind of conversational kind of approach to this rather than 15 minutes of me doing stats and data and then having to wake you all up for Stephen's next bit of the presentation. So we're just going to rattle through some of the stats and some of the stuff here, but kind of a bit of a conversation. So first off, just to give you a little bit of history of how we've got to where we are. So we've kind of titled this, A Housing Challenge, What Next After 20 Years of Growth? We've seen some significant growth in Orkney's population over the last 20 years, and this is the slide I always start with when we're talking about this. This is Orkney's unemployment percentage from 2005 all the way through to 2025. Orkney is the blue line at the bottom, Scotland's orange, UK is green, and this black dotted line, that is the economic definition for full employment. And as you'll see, we spend a lot of our time below that line. So we've been importing our workforce because we've had a really strong economy, which is excellent news. We've got some really, really good companies. We've got people looking to grow, and we just haven't had the workforce. So that leads to this. This is Orkney's population from 1981 over here, all the way through to 2023, which is the latest stats and data we've got. You'll see 2001, massive spike in our population there. You'll then see a little dotted blue line. Those are mid-year population estimates from about 2011 through to about 2021. That's our population. It's all modelled, and it was modelled on the previous 10 years. It saw our population shoot up to about 22,500 people, so not too far behind Shetland. You'll then see a really steep drop, which is the 2022 census. So that says actually our population is just under 22,000, 21,995 or something along those lines. And then the mid-year estimates show it again bouncing a little bit. Now, a lot of people will tell you, oh, that means all the estimates are wrong. There's not people wanting to come to Orkney, or we've not got the level of demand and stuff that we've had. My opinion is we ran out of houses. The demand is there. The demand has been there since 2001. We still have the jobs. We can all still see every single week on Facebook half a dozen posts of people moving in, looking for housing because they've got a job they want to move into, and they're unable to find housing stock. So I don't think the demand has slipped. I just think our supply hasn't caught up.
I think that's something we continue to see week on week and month on month. We continue to receive inquiries from all over for people wanting to build and buy houses, whether it be in one of the developments we're building or looking for us to source a piece of land for them to build a house and move up here. Generally, it's professional people or people who have moved here because they've got a work connection.
No, and that's it exactly. Next, we're moving on to this is our net migration by council area. So this is from 1994, again up to 22, 23, and you'll see post that 2001, we've had a net positive migration. So this little line that's between the 50 and the minus 50, that's zero. Anything above that line is positive, anything below it is negative. We've had that positive net in migration every single year. These are our neighbours to the north, that's Shetland. You'll see again quite a steep depopulation, but then they've been above it, beyond it, below it. Outer Hebrides, it was 2003-04 before they actually saw any significant and positive population migration. The figures go further back. They go back as far as 1986, but this graph would have been very, very muddy had I done that. Outer Hebrides hadn't had a positive net population in migration since 1985-86, before that 2003-04. So they'd seen significant net population decline, whereas ourselves, it's been a positive for the vast majority of the time. We're breaking it down a little bit here. This is East Mainland. Population change by different areas in East Mainland. This is census data. So the blue is between 2001 and 2022. The red is between 2011 and 2022. So you'll see East Mainland, South Ronaldsay, Bury, even Ham, Dearness, some really, really positive figures there. So that's an area that's grown significantly in Orkney over that last 20 years. The final one, Tankernas, Tobe, east of Kirkwall, that's a data zone. It covers the likes of Ham and St Mary's, and it covers the airfield and various things, airport, but also kind of comes in almost to Bignell Park, so it actually has bits of Kirkwall in it. This is the East Mainland elements. I've split those out. But again, you'll see fringes of Kirkwall, significant population growth.
It's worth mentioning there too that, just going from personal experience, we've built council houses in South Ronaldsay in the Hope. O'Hall's built in Bury. Both us and another developer have built at each end of St Mary's. O'Hall have built 2 phases in Dearness, and there's been a number of clusters of houses permitted in Tankernas and Tobe. So the top line there's attributed to the ability, I would say, for developers, whether that be in the private or public sector, to actually build.
Absolutely. Bottom line here is Stromness in the West Mainland. Stromness South here, you'll see a bit of growth overall, but actually significant depopulation in terms of loss of people between 2011 and 2022. Lots of second homes and things in Stromness. Again, that area around Stromness Pier. But that's been offset because the outskirts of the town, around the parish area and around Garson, have grown quite significantly. So the population in Stromness is very, very similar to what it was. It hasn't really dropped, but it's shifted. It's moved. West Mainland's the same. You'll see between 2001 and 2022, growth across every single area because we've had that massive population spike. But between 2011 and 2022, the outlying areas, Sandwick, where I grew up, Sandwick and Bursey, Evie and Costa, those areas have actually seen a population decline because everything's being centralised, everything's moving towards the core. So the outlying areas didn't happen in South Ronaldsay and Bury, we're still seeing strength there. But in rural West Mainland, we're seeing that focus on Kirkwall. It's stripping away from Stromness and it's stripping away from the rural West Mainland.
Jumping in there again, that's interesting. At the county show this year, one of my pals for Sandwick, that's the same age as Luke and I actually, was in the, well, he wasn't in the pen next to me, his wife's pony was. And I wasn't in the pen where pony was. And he and I got chatting because it was a huge day for him and his family because both his boys were playing in the parish cup that night. And interestingly, I just said, God, it's interesting that I used to just expect you to be in the parish final every year when we were young, and they were. Sandwick, anybody will look back to the 90s into the early 2000s, Sandwick were always a highly likely contender for the final, if not the winner of the parish cup, but they've been very quiet in recent years, and this is anecdotal, but he said it himself there and then, he says, well, folk can't build in Sandwick, can't come and stay here. And so, we've got no young folk to make a team anymore. Now, that's a pretty dramatic change for someone who's born and bred Sandwick, lived there all his life, farmer, and he's got his family, and they're all, him and the wider group of friends and family all want to continue to live in Sandwick, and their children to be able to build there and live, but they can't. So that was a really interesting anecdote.
No, and that's certainly something we're seeing more of in it. Next one is Kirkwall. Again, significant growth. These areas here, on the far left on this side, all on the edge of town. So we're seeing that significant growth. We see all the new houses, so that makes sense. So there's lots happening. Kirkwall's population is going up, but you're also seeing some areas like Ham Branch Road, the fourth in here. Ham Branch Road, Easdale Lone, Lynn Park, areas that are quite established, probably 80s and 90s build mostly. It's not that we're losing households there. It's the fact that generally it's older households whose kids have moved out, but they've still got the older households in those properties. You've got some of that with the likes of Coy Banks, Piper's Coy, some of the other areas as well, where you've just got that shift in demographic. It's changing the population of that particular area. It's not that the population is dropping. In some areas, we are getting more second homes, but in the middle of Kirkwall, it's very difficult to build many more houses. So you're not getting additional stock. It's just the demographic within that area is changing.
I think as well, in the centre of Kirkwall particularly, it's similar to Stromness in some cases, where a lot of the older housing stock that changes hands has become self-catered and short-term let. So I think we're in about between 10 and 14% of the houses in Kirkwall, I believe, have a short-term let licence now. So some of those declines are in the town centre and the older stock and the older parts of Kirkwall. Older, I mean 60s, 70s, 80s houses. Could be because they're going into the short-term lets to a degree, whereas all the big spikes on the left are generally where I've been building housing schemes for the last 15 years, basically.
So yeah, that's exactly right. And the same with Stromness, the old town we saw in the previous graph. That's a conservation area. So if you want to rent those houses out privately, you've got to hit certain energy efficiency standards, which is really, really difficult to do in really, really old properties. So they end up becoming short-term lets because you can't use it as a long-term. And the final one of these slides is this is the Isles. So this is showing you again those changes. Papa Westry, Rousey in the last 10, 12 years, Sandy to an extent, really good news stories. Everywhere else, you're seeing declines. And that's the kind of the issues there, and some of the percentage terms are significant, particularly like Egglesey and Wyre, and there's some significant percentages reductions in those areas. But those are all the kind of negatives. This, in a sense, that shows us that the supply isn't there. But this graph gives you some background on that. So this top graph, this is the percentage change in households between 2001 and 2024. So this is your number of households in 2001, number of households in 2024. What's the percentage change? Orkney is far right. We're that red line. We're the second highest percentage household growth of any Scottish local authority. Now, around us, East Lothian, Mid Lothian, Aberdeenshire, Highland, West Lothian, key commuter areas and key growth areas. So we're punching well above our weight in terms of household growth, and this is with a housing shortage. The line beneath, this is the percentage change in dwellings. So this is the number of properties we've built, again, that have been built in that 20 years. So the number of additional properties in those 20 years, again, we're fourth. There was a time until 2014, 2015, where we were the highest percentage increase of any area in Scotland. And again, we're alongside Mid Lothian, East Lothian, West Lothian, those areas where you can't turn around and throw a stone without hitting a new housing development. Now, okay, this is percentage terms. We're talking 1,200, 1,400 houses in Orkney. But when you've got 11,000 stock, that's a big change. So we have been building at a significant rate. Albeit it's Clouston's, there's lots going on.
Yeah, that leads on. I was going to say that demonstrates, I would say, that we do have a kind of heritage of building and developing new houses at a reasonably high rate in relation to our population size, and I think that kicked off just before my time in the mid to late 70s when Dad was building Park the Least, and that was a real stimulus to demonstrate what could be done by a local firm. And I grew up in that sort of environment following that, where the Orkney Housing Association was in growth, and they led the charge really for 2 decades thereafter, and have continued to develop a lot of houses. And obviously then in about 2010 up to 2014 we saw the local authority alongside OHAL have a big spurt in house building development, and conjoin all of that, and I suppose that's the result I think it demonstrates we've got a facility and an ability to continue building. And I suppose from my point of view, I think that's something I wouldn't like to see us, the red line slip to the left here on either of those graphs in the years ahead.
Yeah, no, and that's exactly it. So we've done that building, we've built at that level, but we still haven't been able to meet the demand. So the demand local, but also the demand external has been significant, and that has led to this. This is the increase in house prices in Orkney from 2003-04 to June this year. So the July data is not out yet, but June this year. So you'll see in 2003-04, average house price around £65,000. Now it's around 214,000. The area I want you to look at is here. That is COVID, that's post-COVID. A £53,000 increase in a 2-year period. The average house price in Orkney over that time has gone up by about £7,000 to £8,000 a year. Show me a young household that can stand still in that, never mind actually save enough to start getting closer to buying a house. So we've seen significant increases, and then these are our neighbours. Scotland is the yellow, so you'll see that we've got so much closer to the Scottish average. We're not there yet, so we're still, but we hit it at end of COVID, we hit it 22. We've fallen back a little bit, but Shetland is the orange. They again saw a big COVID spike. Outer Hebrides has never really caught up with us. They saw a bit of a spike at COVID. They did see a lot more households moving in. They saw a significant increase in households, but because they had available housing stock, they didn't get that supply and demand issue. Well, we had a significant issue of where a lot of people looking to move here, a lot of people looking to stay here, and we had limited housing supply. And again, the likes of Stephen couldn't build.
And it's interesting too when you consider the peak there at the average price on the far right, and average obviously is all properties sold, but the houses that we are building now, that the 2- and 3-bedroom semi-detached and terrace houses are probably what I would call the average houses for the population, for young folk to buy, and we now need somewhere in the region of 225 to 235,000 to build a 2-up, 2-down, 68 square metre house with a driveway and a small garden. And that's about 5% margin, which that you're permitted as a government-funded developer. So we actually get grants to support us to take the houses down to market value to the tune of 40 and 50,000 to enable people who have a key, a work or a family connection to the area. So although the average price there is 210, 230 hour build cost for a affordable 2-bedroom house is almost the same, if not above that, but the market value of it's between 170 and 180. So we're, with inflation and wage inflation, materials inflation, having run a bit rampant in the last 5 or 6 years, we are at a very difficult point now in the market locally.
And yeah, just building on that, I know people who were building in the early 2000s who would build a house self-build or get a contractor to build it. They could then sell it 2 or 3 days later for a profit. You can't, as Stephen's outlined, you can't do that anymore. So that market has changed and made things more difficult. And the last graph, you'll be pleased to know, this is looking forward. So this is Orkney's population projection between 2018 and 2043. The 0 to 15 is here, then 16 to 39 age group, 40 to 64, 65 to 74, and then 75 plus. Each of these vertical bars is a year. So this is 2018 and working its way across. As you'll see in the age groups there, 2015, the projection, and a projection is different from a forecast. The projection is this is what will happen if nothing changes, is that we will lose around about 708 people in that category at 20%. We will lose about, just again, 750 people in that 16 to 39, as good as 900 of our 40 to 64-year-olds. 65 to 74 is not going to change much, but we will see an increase of the over 75s from 2,200 to about 4,200. So a significant increase there. And then, when you look at this, at that same point, when you're seeing a significant increase of over 2,000 people in the over 75 category, we're losing 1,600 workers.
I think it's interesting. It frightens me actually suddenly. I'm looking at all these slides and standing here, we're looking, I realise I can look 2.5 decades backwards like it was yesterday. And but having in various roles over the years, both of us have been at meetings with Luke and presentations where he's been reinforcing this population demographic issue now for all of our working lives, 20 odd years, home here, in the same community, in the same circles, doing the same sort of things, and we're here in 2025 still looking at the same graph, we're looking down the barrel of the shotgun, so to speak, at the same big problem at the far right there. And it's just an observation, I suppose. 20 years on, here we are, talking about the same thing, but what have we actually done, or what are we going to do?
And that far right isn't an issue. Sorry, far right of the graph. I'll rephrase that. Don't quote me on that. Oh, okay. The far right, okay, there we go. That's not an issue if we can address the bit in the middle. Because we struggle at the minute for workforce. My wife's a former carer, and she go to work every single day and night because of the fact that we're short of carers. We're bringing carers in. The council spending a huge amount of money on bringing staff in. That's not the council's fault. It's just where we are in terms of our demographic and our community. We are an island, and I'm the chair of the Scottish Highlands Federation. We say it a lot to people in the Central Belt, is we can't just bring people in to commute on a daily basis because we're an island. We're not the Central Belt. We're something that you can just import workforce from elsewhere. We have to have an on-the-ground workforce. So one of the key things, and we're just going to get to our recommendations in a minute, is the focus on we have to house that, or help house that older population. And a lot of the housing stock we can house them in is here. It just either needs adapting, or it needs changing, or it needs switching. So we build some smaller units, and we've got some of the Hopeco housing ladies here looking at that same sort of idea, trying to build accommodation that is fit for an older population. We build some of that, but we make use of the accommodation they're coming out of as family housing. We need to retrofit, we need to do things with it to try and make it more energy efficient in some cases, and put renewables on it, and that was discussed with Neil and Gareth this morning. But we have a significant housing stock. We just have to probably make better use of it, and we have to make sure the stock that we develop is actually the stock that we need. It's not just stock that someone dreams up. So we've got 3 recommendations. First of which was, it was been mentioned already this morning in the energy presentation, and it's the development of an Orkney vision. It's a wider perspective, wider picture on where do we want our community to be in 20 years. What do we want the makeup to be? What with things like the demographics? How do we adjust that? How do we work through that? How do we get that to where we think we need it to be in a sustainable fashion, where we can meet the needs of everybody in our community? What opportunities can we tap into? So what's coming down the line? Renewables and various things. So what are the opportunities for our economy? But also, what are the challenges? What are the things that might come? And the food presentation this morning was brilliant. You know, that food resilience, that food security, but also energy and climate. But it has to be a community vision. Not a vision developed by just one organisation, but a vision that is ground up, that says, actually, this is what we want our island to be, because it has to have ownership. And having written strategy for the council for well over a decade, it's really difficult to get the community to buy into something you've just come up with, that they've not come up with themselves. So we see as an issue, how do we address that? And the vision's a potential way of doing that.
Yeah, I think so. And you know, it's a big challenge, I think, for all organisations that are building houses, because they've all got their own policy requirements, and we've all, you know, got our objectives to meet. You know, so the local authority have to provide social rented housing. That's what they do. They are not a shared equity developer or a private developer. You know, so when they develop a housing development, they've got very specific criteria to meet. Likewise, OHA, the Housing Association, they're providing housing, social rent, also shared equity and potentially mid-market rent and other tenancy formats. But they, again, are bound by certain policy requirements. And then, as a private developer, I guess I'm building to the market. Traditionally, I'm from a bulk or a volume house building background, hence I've always focused on trying to build, you know, economically and affordable houses and attract as many different grant sources as possible as we can as a private developer. But then we're bound by the market. So, you know, for example, as we went through Wallywell next door, we had to very carefully, you know, maybe for 2 years build 2 and 3 bedrooms, and then another 2 years build 4 and 5 with some 2 and 3. Then we could go back to 1 and 2 because we could only build when we had a guaranteed demand, or, you know, we can't go on very long without selling a product because we're a private local company. So that's a big, difficult piece of work when you've got everyone providing houses according to their own policy requirements. But at what point does that all come together and everyone sit and decide what's best overall, not just for their individual organisation? I guess that's something that's always in my mind.
No, that's really good. And the council's got various strategies. It's got the local development plan, obviously, on the planning front. It's got the local housing strategy that does some of that strategic stuff there as well. But I think what we're looking at here is it's beyond housing. We've suggested it in the housing bit just because housing is a facilitator. It's not the solution to everything, but it is. If you want to do transport, if you want to create jobs, you need the housing stock, especially in an island area, to be able to do that. So this is a good way of facilitating being able to do the other stuff. So we've brought it up here just because we think actually it's a good place to just kind of facilitate. It isn't a housing vision, because the council has its local housing strategy, but it's a wider vision for what we want our community to be. It's our but demographics are a key element of that. So linked to that, the next little recommendation is this is the balance, a focus on retaining and attracting young people. Howie's mentioned that in his intro. The one demographic that cannot meet its need in the market is younger people. You've seen that with the house price increase. Over 50% of Orkney's housing stock is owned outright. So that means if you bought a house in 2003 at 60 grand, chances are it's now worth 214 and you own that outright. So if you want to upside or downsize, you've got the financial capacity to do so. If you're a young person in probably not a permanent job, good luck. And social rented is a brilliant tenure. It's there for a certain, people that track that. We've got a lot of low-cost home ownership we're looking at developing. The Housing Association, I work a day a week for, are doing some of that. The council's hugely supportive of mid-market rent, which is another kind of now grant-supported or just coming in grant-supported tenancy. So, and then there's market housing, which, as Stephen's saying, it's difficult to develop at the scale we need to. But if we can focus on younger persons' housing, it helps the likes of UHI and Heriot Watt, because we used to have loads of students come in here every single year to Heriot Watt, and they're like, we can't anymore because they can't find accommodation. And those areas we need those academic institutions to be strong so that we can develop that workforce, as we've done with Aquaterra, EMEC. The number of people I've worked with my Aquaterra hat on who've come from other places because they've done that study. And it'll be the same with your apprentices and things.
Absolutely, and I think when you can, we've got graduate apprentices who never go near university, but I guess economically we don't want all our students to be remote. That's very much a part of the lifeblood of the place, is having those young people and young students coming in with their new ideas and a lot of energy, and but they need houses. And actually, in the top point there, just today we've actually got a house completing, the first of a pair of semi-detached houses just up the road here that were government grant funded for either key worker or people with a family or a work connection. And it's a young woman who's a teacher coming home back to Orkney to live, and in a few weeks' time the other half of that semi-detached pair of houses is coincidentally a school friend of hers who's a dentist coming home. So that's two young professionals coming home to work because they can get houses at an affordable price that can facilitate their step into the Orkney housing market when they've been living away in City South. So I do think that is a real key component, because, as Luke says, while we have this enormous social housing waiting list, the big predicament is that if you relentlessly try to support and feed into that, you use all your resources, and if you don't allocate some of them to houses that take young people back, how are we ever going to plug that gap? Because we really need the new and younger people to be coming here, not just replicating in new houses to move people around within the existing population. But we have to do a bit of it all.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've noticed, friends of mine bought a two-bed house off Stephen when they had one child. They then bought a three-bed house. They're now in a four-bed house. Again, in the same sort of schemes, as the properties are developed, they're working their way up through. It gives them that chance to kind of expand, particularly if you're in Kirkwall. So that is, it's that focus. And say one of the key things, we're not focusing on every area here, because a lot of these areas are covered already. The council has a key worker strategy. There are strategies out there, but what we're trying to focus on is a couple of the key areas where these are key demographic challenges. So that's the second one. There's young people. And the final one, last slide, is balance on how we sustain strongness in rural and island areas. A lot of our development is focused on Kirkwall. Now, people will tell you that's because where everybody wants to live in Kirkwall. Well, the only people I hear saying that are people who live in Kirkwall. I don't live in Kirkwall. I've never lived in Kirkwall. And I understand it is the place where we have significant population growth. We have a lot of growth, and a lot of people do want to live in Kirkwall. The market's following that, and that's absolutely fine. But what we are seeing is a centralisation of everything. And one of the key issues we've got, and again, when I was at the council, I did all the demographic forecasting, so this stuff, I did the housing needs analysis, but I also did all the school roll forecasting as well. And we're at a point where for every house, you're getting about 0.27 children of primary school age for every new build property. So if we build 1,000 houses around Kirkwall, we're well on the way to it, that's 270 kids. That's Gleitness, and then some. Gleitness is mostly full, Platdale is mostly full. We've got significant transport, Scottish Water, various things. There's an awful lot of money would need to be spent on Kirkwall to enhance its infrastructure to the point where it can accommodate another 10 years, significant proportion of 10 years worth of next development. So if the decision is made in that Orkney vision, or whatever, however we want to do it, that we want more housing and more growth, it can't all be focused on Kirkwall because we physically couldn't afford to do it. But we have areas in the rural West Mainland where the schools are half full. We have infrastructure in some of these other areas, so we've got potential. So West Mainland, I get laughed at every time I mention this, potential new settlement.
I'm glad Luke's just said that, because I've been desperate to say, I'm caveating this slide, the West Mainland new settlement's his idea, not mine.
And I'm not saying it's something we should do, but I'm saying it's something we potentially should look at. Because if you're looking to sustain in terms of transport, in terms of those other things as well, there's potential in those areas. And it's, if we're not going to build, we've got, was it 1,600 sites zoned for housing in Orkney at the moment, 1,000 of them are in Kirkwall. So the vast majority still, within an existing way of doing stuff, has to be built in the town.
And there are really positive policies now that didn't used to exist 5-6 years ago with the likes of Scottish Water. So this is purely an example, hypothetical, but if you went to Doonby and said we're going to put 200 houses somewhere around about Doonby within the catchment of the existing infrastructure, Scottish Water have a policy whereby they'll support you and pay for the sewerage and water upgrades. I think it was SR21 or something was their terminology for it, and they are intent on continuing that. So they actually supported us with the water main up Gleitness Road, and some of you might have seen diggers in the PDC. That was us putting a new bypass sewer. So we took the whole west of Kirkwall sewerage and bypassed it right through the PDC into their road pumping station a couple of years ago, and that freed up another 500 houses worth of capacity in the west of Kirkwall. Essentially, we've opened up all the utilities as a result to let us build for another 10 to 15 years. But as Luke says, there is nothing to stop that happening in any other village or town or settlement in Orkney. And I do think it's something that merits a bit of exploration, because there's talk of developer contributions and things like that that's commonplace in every city and town elsewhere in Scotland, where a developer like us would typically go in, make 30-40% margin. The local authority quite rightly goes and says, right, we want a contribution, we'll take 15,000 or 10,000 for every house you hand over, and we're going to put it in a pot, and it'll go towards upgrading infrastructure, schools, health centres, the likes. New in Orkney, where you're building affordable houses that are 20% or thereby grant funded already by the government, developer contributions as a concept don't work. So we kind of need to be a bit clever and look at it a bit differently up here.
Yep, and that's dead right. So the final bit, just the Isles. We're doing a lot of housing in the Isles, lots of community-led housing in the Isles. Most of the islands have actually developed at least one unit. Some are now on their third or their fourth kind of phase. The Scottish Government have a fund called the Rural and Islands Housing Fund, which is brilliant, very flexible fund. The council has bought into this as well. They're giving £40,000 to £50,000 of funding to each island to support them, per unit to support them on that, which is one of the only 2 or 3 councils in the country that are doing it. So there's been some real support there. But when we're looking at the Isles, it's that shifting that focal point of the North Isles, in particular from Kirkwall back to the North Isles. And that's transport, so we'll come to that, and we won't come to that, but that'll come to in a minute. Third plane, the new announcement of the third plane is brilliant. And the new ferry stuff coming on is really, really good. So the hope is that if we can shift that focal point in the Isles, if we can help the Isles do inter-island transport and support them to kind of do some more of that stuff, that'll hopefully make a real difference there. But it's that allowing us to develop and allowing rural areas, if people want to live in rural areas, how can we best enable them to do so? And let's have an actual open conversation about how we can potentially best enable them to do so. Because we probably have a lot of the solutions are there already. It's just trying to tie them all together. And it's coming up, but it's first admitting that we have an issue of some of our very remote rural areas on mainland Orkney are struggling at the minute because of the fact that most of the development, most of the service stuff is in and around Kirkwall. That's us.
That is fascinating. And the panel now will come in with, each of the panel will have a question for you both. So I'll go along and pass to Alexander first.
Right, a lot of your talk was about the cost of the housing being significantly higher. Why is the cost so high to build here in Orkney?
I think it's just you've got a limited resource pool with labour. So, for example, when we employ brickies as an example in Orkney, 365 days a year, whereas in central Scotland, they just didn't turn up on a frosty day or a bad rainy day. They all were at fixed price, so they went like the clappers, if you like, for the time because they were all self-employed. So it was good summer weather, good weather. You saw windy days, you saw bad days, sickness, etc. like that. The individuals paid for that themselves, so it's a completely different employment model. So, we support our guys 365 days a year, so when production in January and December is very low, they're still getting a wage every day. So that's just about every builder in Orkney operates that way. So that's one increased cost. The same as you'll acutely feel the cost of moving stuff on and off islands here, materials. As a farmer, you'll ken all about that. And so we've got that problem, but also the volatility in the materials production market. So, just last week, we got notified that Redland Roofing Tiles, their global owner, Monnier, has just withdrawn from the country. So they're shutting down. So Redland Roofing's been the biggest provider of roof tiles to the north half of Britain for 30 years, and they've just shut down. Scott Frame, that I'm sure everyone's heard of, they told me on Friday that they are closing in Inverurie. They're done. For all modular housing and off-site produced, they're just going to go for bulk kits. That was Saint-Gobain bought them. Saint-Gobain make everything from the Tesla windscreens to goodness knows what building materials. A few years back, they bought Scott Frame from Bob, and they were going to do the off-site, self-build market was going to be a big thing. It's kind of reduced, so being a global sort of big company, rather than go and try and firefight, they've just shut it. So, all of a sudden we're seeing this volatility come into the market. Materials and products that we've been able to just buy for decades are dropping off now, and this is still a result of COVID. Timber prices never fully recovered, and the likes of cement and the energy-heavy products have always kept going up, 8 and 10% a year, or thereby. Oh, is that better? Is that louder? No. Apologies.
You mentioned making better use of housing stock. Could you drill into that a wee bit more, and if you've got any practical suggestions or specifics about how that might happen?
Yeah, I think some of it comes down to we've got a lot of properties, a lot of larger properties with people in them who've potentially been in them for a number of years. Kids that they've raised a family in them, and they're maybe too large for them at the minute. Now, a lot of households don't want to move because they've got memories and various things, and that's absolutely fine. One of my roles at the council was running the team that did all the energy efficiency projects, so retrofit and various things, and put insulation on, put new heating systems in, and there's funding for that. But some of these houses are very, very large. So if you've got a single person in it, they're often only heating one room. So they're using one room, they're living in one room, that's all they're using in that space. So the best way of us being able to make use of the quite limited, 11,000 properties isn't a huge number when you're talking 22,000 people, is if we can make best use of people who are willing and want to downsize, it's helping them and facilitating them to do so. We've got quite a lot of empty properties. If we can get younger people to be able to access an empty property, get funding support to do one up. We've got a lot of young folk who are either electricians or they're working with Stephen, or their dad's a plumber. A whole new build may be something that actually they kind of think is a bit too much for them, but taking on an empty property and getting your friends and family to help you, or a lot of the single self-employed guys to help you do that property up, is a really good option. One of the ones we've got in here, was the previous slide, was we've got a lot of the private rental market in Orkney is quite a strong market. We've got about 1,000 properties and about 1,100 properties, about 1,000 landlords. So that shows most of our landlords own one house. The government is adding more and more and more regulation to the private rented sector. So we're running risk of losing those properties either to people to think, you know what, too much hassle, I'll do a short-term rent instead, or I'll just sell up. So could we find some way, if they've got a household in that, a tenant who'd quite like to take on that property, instead of having to go through the muddle of evicting the tenant and then marketing the house for sale, well, could they potentially sell it to the tenant? Could we do a shared ownership where the tenant buys a percentage, the government buys a percentage, like we do a shared ownership, as an option there as well?
Yeah, it's just worth noting there as well. We mentioned at the very start that all of us see it, on Facebook and places like that. Every week someone's looking for a house. I've got a job at NHS, I've got a job at the council, I'm moving up in 2 months. And traditionally, especially coming into this time of year, the holiday lets would all be becoming empty. And there was always folk that were prepared to let someone rent their holiday let for 5 or 6 or 7 months over the winter. And then you could get out next April or May or June. And obviously, and sadly, with the tenancy rules that were brought in by the Scottish Government, preventing any sort of end date to a tenancy or a domestic tenancy, but paired with the fact you've got short-term lets can only be let out for a month at a time, it makes it very hard now for folk to facilitate new incomers to the island. And that, I think, is a big barrier, because folk could traditionally get a house for 5 or 6 months, find their feet, see a property that was for them, and then move again. But that is a big roadblock, I feel.
Yeah, I just have a question. We have talked about in the policy about community wealth building the circular economy. You had the slides there about, our fate in Orkney compared to our island neighbours. And I just wondered, is there a risk if we don't nurture this local construction industry? Because I know in Shetland and the Western Isles, there's not such a local economy built around that construction and the colleges and things like that. So I just wondered, how much of a protective element having that local construction industry has played in some of the statistics we've seen today.
Yeah, I think if you look at the number of houses built per year on average over the last 20 years, I think it's usually always between 60 and 80. Now, a lot of those years it's been predominantly private, 40 or 50, and sometimes only 20 or 30 government or social rented or government funded houses. But then in other years, especially when the council and OHAL were in full swing about a decade and a half ago with their developments, you saw that go up to about 50 or 60 affordable grant funded houses per year. So traditionally we've had that capacity to build. It's just about always all been done by local workforce, local contractors and subcontractors and local developers. And I think you've hit the nail on the head there. The feeling right now in the industry, you've got Bob Clouston Limited coming off the care home. We are kind of just slowing down and waiting patiently at Wallyworld to hopefully get another phase in the go. But there isn't a big pipeline out there for the size of the local industry. And we've got huge competition now that tends to be growing and growing from other sectors like aquaculture and all their supply services that offer really high quality, highly paid jobs. And it's very similar entrants that can choose between option A and option B, if you like. So we've been working very hard as a sector to create careers events. In fact, that's my first meeting tomorrow as a careers event planning meeting. We're starting to see the fruits of that. After COVID, I think all the young folks struggled, and the schools and education struggled to get back into a normal routine, but now we're actually seeing a good number of entrants. I employed 5 apprentices a few weeks ago, the new entrants for this year. That's our biggest ever single intake in a year, but that was young folk that we had been working on with the school for about 2 years to get through work experience, meet them at careers events. And the worry is that if we don't have the work face ahead to keep putting these young folk to, we will start to see employers reduce the number of new entrants. And certainly this year and next, I'm suddenly looking at quite a few of the really good, some of the best folk that we've got are all retiring because they're all in their mid-60s, and it's really hard to replace half a dozen older folk, because for that you need 10 apprentices at various stages just to replicate the work of that 5 or 6 people. So it is a big problem, but the number one that we need is basically a pipeline.
Now the roving microphone is here, and we're looking for questions from the audience. And I see right at the back there's a question.
I'm coming. Hello there. Given that there are no, I believe, my understanding is there are no co-housing live sites at the moment in Scotland, would that actual templates be able to be applied to other sectors apart from older people? For example, student accommodation or accommodation for doctors, nurses, etc. How feasible is that, given the cost of actually building those is far less than individual houses?
Yeah, the co-housing model is used, it's used widely throughout Europe. It's often multi-generational, so there's often younger people and older people mixed in some of that. A number of the ones in the UK are predominantly older people co-housing. But I think there is one of the key opportunities we've got probably across rural and island Scotland, and it may be a little bit past this in Orkney, is with Scottish and Southern Energy Networks doing all the upgrade works, putting lots more infrastructure in and various things. There is opportunity there for the workers' accommodation that they need to develop for that short-term workforce to be able to be used in the longer term, but it needs to be accommodation that is suitable. So we, again, remember 7 or 8 years ago having that kind of conversation about, can we potentially use all the different funding pots to come up with something that these guys use for 2 years and then becomes long-term housing afterwards. Now that can be, it's still individual units, but it can often be done in a way that it's the build type's a little bit different. So it makes it more terraces and various things. It's a more affordable way to deliver housing. But co-housing is certainly an opportunity, I think, for older person, but there's nothing stopping it being an opportunity for younger people. 3-4 bed house. I know when I went to university, Stephen was saying, you'd share a house. That was just what you did. You didn't expect to get a 1-bedroom flat yourself because it was too expensive. But it's trying to go back to that kind of way of saying, well, actually, what can we develop that's required? So be it Herrick Watt bringing staff in, even as Stephen mentioned, short term, just a few months before they need to move on to something else. How can we develop housing within the confines of the legal and the legislative framework that allows us to be as flexible as we possibly can be? And it's quite difficult to do, but there's certainly opportunities and ways of doing it.
Thank you. Stephen, you alluded earlier to legislation or newish legislation being a barrier to people taking what would you call it, mid-term lets. Do you think that there is any possibility of finding a way around that situation? And do you think, and I'm going to be very provocative now, do you think we need to relax legislation, particularly planning legislation, to enable better access to houses?
Yeah, so there's the tenancy legislation there, and I think tenancy legislation was created by the Scottish Government, as we see it today, to deal with problems in the likes of Edinburgh, tourist hotspots where landlords, well, I've seen it done to us, where they just they turf you out. They actually sublet our flat. I remember over summer they took God knows how much off of us over the year. We still rented that over the summer to retain it, but then had to lock our stuff in a big cupboard in the middle of it, and they rented it out all summer at double the rates. And that's a thing that's become challenging, because obviously in Edinburgh and stairwells you've got stag do's and goodness knows what now up all these residential stairwells. So as we all know, the Scottish Government's answer to that was to put in place some legislation to stop that, which had the massive unintended consequences for rural and island and Highlands Scotland. So I don't know if we'll ever get the government to relax in that, but I guess we mentioned mid-market rent as one new tenure to Orkney that looks like it's on the horizon, and that could be a really key tenure in the future, and I know the local authorities got that in their sights, and potentially the Housing Association as well. In terms of planning, well, we mentioned the anecdote I told you about not being able to build in the countryside, and I myself have come across it a few times in the last 10 years where I think planning policy isn't able to keep up with changing requirements out in the country now, and I think I've said it, committee and appeals and things, that there just aren't the sites now that fit the pictures in the development plan that was made. Those were sketches created 12 years ago, 10 years ago, and the Housing in the Countryside Design Guide, as we know it, has an awful lot of good qualities, but we've kind of exhausted an awful lot of the opportunities, and we need it to be refreshed so that the next generation of folk new 10 years on can actually go and access and build a house along the road for their mum and dad in Sandwick or Harry or wherever it may be, because if we don't do that, we're just going to do exactly what Luke said before and continue to build in Kirkwall, which I should, selfishly, I would say that's the best thing in the world for me, because it's very easy and it lets me just do the same as I've done for 15 years for the next 15. But for Orkney, I think that could be the very worst thing we could do.
I'll just build on that a little bit. In terms of that medium-term rental, we used to do gateway housing in the islands. Papa Westra did it brilliantly. And that was where you moved in, you got a 12-month tenancy, you kind of try before you buy, you got to know the community got to know you. So when a private rental came up, they were kind of, oh yeah, we know this person now, they would rent to you. Whereas they're not going to rent to somebody just coming off the boat because they don't know them. We lost that when that private tenancy bill changed. It was an entirely unintended consequence. We had Scottish government MSPs coming to us and saying, we really like this, and I'm going, brilliant, but you've just torpedoed it. So we've looked at bringing that back. We looked at it again, so I mentioned it in the Islands deal as a potential to kind of go and say, well, this is a bit of legislation that doesn't work. Not releasing every landlord to release every property from that, but to have specific, be it development trusts on mainland Orkney or Islands, to say this specific house rented out by this specific body could be rented on a 12-month gateway housing style tenancy. So I don't think we'll get a carte blanche change, but I think there's real opportunity to make a case that there is a requirement in the Isles for that medium term, not a short-term month let, but not an endless tenancy. There's got to be some way of making that argument in the middle. I think and on the planning side of stuff, as Stephen mentioned, the local development plan, to be fair to the council, is coming up for review. They're working through it at the moment. It is a 10-year-old document. So we've used up the sites, which is brilliant. We're not at a point where nothing's been developed. But an awful lot of the planning stuff is coming down from the Scottish Government. It's Holyrood that's imposing an awful lot of this on us, and it's making it difficult. A Scottish passive house, I don't know if it's a passive house with a kilt, I don't know, but that will make our building costs exponentially more expensive. And when you're primarily building semi-detached and detached houses, good luck, we're not building flats. So again, what's coming down nationally, National Planning Framework 4, covers Glasgow and Egglesey. That's not going to work.
Yeah, and I think the National Planning Framework 4 has really that's the latest, well, there's folk in the room that ken what it is, but it's the latest policy that every local authority, planning department in the country is bound to comply with and set their local policies within. And it's set the cat amongst the pigeons. And again, the original consultation document had this requirement throughout the whole of Scotland for what they called a 20-minute neighbourhood. You should be able to go to the doctor and the school and the local shop all within a 20-minute walk of your house and any new housing development. And of course, for 90% of the geography of Scotland, that's impossible. But that was the officers and the policy makers in the government actually created that document. There was obviously a huge amount of consultation that was negative, and they did change it a wee bit, and they took that golden thread out. But we're still looking at some ridiculous new policies, which is, to be fair to the local authority, they've got a lot of burden placed upon their officers already in terms of time. They can't fill positions, and now there's new positions either having to be created or demanded, i.e. like for biodiversity, because the new National Planning Framework 4 has put a carte blanche requirement on all new planning applications to achieve, I think it's a 15% betterment in biodiversity. And while that's fine, and I think it's put in there in the right spirit, it's completely impractical. And I think there's everyone that's in the development sector like me has got their own experience of this in the last year or two since NPF 4 came in. My particular favourite and most frustrating one was at Hatston at our yard. We've got a great big concrete yard, and we're going to put a shed in it to put more indoor storage in. And we couldn't get permission without providing improved biodiversity. And so we're basically just putting a steel frame shed on concrete. But I knew I'm putting some flower boxes at the front door to comply with the approval. And it's Mickey Mouse stuff, but that's actually what our officers are having to waste time on here. And it's a real shame that a lot of these policies get fire-hosed out of the Scottish Government without real practical consideration.
Have we got time for one more question?
Hello. John Roscott, I'm councillor for Kirkwall East, and I really enjoyed that. I learnt a lot from it, especially the stats, the demographics, and this idea of a community view. I wanted to latch upon something. I was really appreciative of the fact you mentioned young people and indeed students. I've just been helping out Heriot-Watt University by actually housing a student who can't yet find a house until he does find one. And just to emphasize what you were saying, he's fantastic. He's very intelligent, and he knows all about this subject, which is renewables. He even cleaned the house all day yesterday, but that's by the by. I wanted to ask how you were going to move towards assessing the demand for students and how you can supply the needed houses that the academic organisations really crave.
Short answer from me. Okay, on this one, this is something we've struggled with for years. I remember back in my time in the council, running the build programme, various things, finding it's not the students that arrive in Orkney, it's the students that don't come to Orkney. It's the ones that decide to go somewhere else because they can't find a house. They're the ones we need to speak to. To be honest, what we need to do here is, instead of building specific student-rented student housing that is just houses students, if we build mid-market rent that can house visiting workers, can house NHS staff, can house council carers, can house students, can house academic staff coming in from these organisations as well. If we can build a flexible rental style housing, your market goes from here for students to here across the board. So we will be able to fill them regardless because of the fact you're building more flexible accommodation. And that is something that's been looked at, but the issue is it's not been focused at students. Government will not fund student housing, because in Glasgow and Edinburgh other people do it, here nobody else does. So that's another thing we need to go back to SG about. If we want to Heriot-Watt to remain, if we want our student populations to increase and to sustain, we need student accommodation, but we need to be able to fund it in a way that we cannot fund it just now.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent 10 years speaking back and forth to the universities on various concepts, and the big challenge is that there isn't the economy of scale to sustain exclusive student accommodation, even if it's quite flexible. So, and the education organisations, as we know, are not cash rich, so they can't afford to fund it themselves. So it's a kind of catch-22 at the moment, but we are working through that, and I do hope there'll be something positive on the horizon in the next year or two.
There are more questions, and I should say that the two speakers will go right after this to the Grey room where everybody else is welcome. There's tea, coffee and biscuits available. So apologies for more speakers. It's a mark of the stimulating nature of the presentation that there are so many potential questions. I'd now like to ask Finn from the to sum up the findings of the panel. I think it was Finn? Housing? One of you? You can get 30 seconds each.
No.
Oh, you want to confirm? The panel are about to confer. It's it's a bit like the Eurovision jury. They've got 3 recommendations, and they've got to rate them as green for go, red for no go, or amber for more information. The jury have decided it's like the puff of the smoke from the roof of the Vatican.
Right, there's quite a lot happening here. I'll synthesize it all in 30 seconds. But first, all of the speakers this morning and this afternoon have done an immense amount of modelling work, synthesising information, giving us a picture of potential futures. There was a thing around 2010, which was a thing called open data in government, which is a movement that coerced or came from, in some situations, government to allow you to obtain data if you wrote into them to get that data out, so you could then understand what was going on in the inner workings of government. The Danes have done a thing called open modelling, and that's taken it one step further. So that was not just the information, but some of the modelling work, like we've seen earlier on this morning, today, and this afternoon, because it allows you to split the things that specialists know which are true, and the choices that a community can make, And having that as a tool for a community allows us to raise the standard of debate and resolve conflicts about what is true and what is not, and actually, focus in on what the actual best solution is. So I just wanted to raise the idea of open modelling, particularly with the synthesis of all the stuff that's happening today. And what the panel felt was, because the theme is COP, we would have liked to seen something to do with climate change. And some of the sort of themes of this morning woven into the housing situation. So the outcome is green for the Orkney vision, but weave in a little bit more of the other energy information and food, etc., etc.
Thank you very much, Finn. Thank you very much to the speakers, to the panel. We reconvene at 3:30, and the question was, what can make the islands, for instance, more attractive and then accessible for people to live? And our subject then at 3:30 in the final section is transport. I'd just like to round off mentioning again the Grain Air Room for tea and coffee, and a warm thanks to our speakers and our panel.